Okay, got it. Okay, so this is a section about synergetic supply chain and in the bioeconomy, and I will speak for about 35 minutes, and then Tom will speak. And what? So maybe I'll give you the motivation and start rhyming. So I really think that the supply chain are a key element of the bioeconomy. I define the bioeconomy as the use of life and other sciences to produce goods and services, and it includes food, fuel, fiber, green chemistry, environmental services. The concept is general. Every country has different type of applications. Every country has different strategy, and a lot of time you don't see the strategy. Like the U.S. Great bioeconomy, and it's mostly run by the private sector. Europe, in my view, has a relatively poor bioeconomy, but they speak about it. Latin America has a great bioeconomy, but the key, any bioeconomy that you are dealing with has big emphasis on supply chain, and we need to understand it. For example, biofuel require feedstock, processing, and sometimes special equipment. Each of them need a supply chain. Green chemistry requires discovering new type of product, processing it, using them. We have problems that that's called the chicken and the egg program. So you need to develop a lot of supply chain, and we need to have theory of supply chain. Now, my journey with supply chain start working with Madhu on biofuel, and I realized that in order that to develop the industry, you need to develop supply chain. And then I start consulting for Mars, and I realized that their big problem is how you develop supply chain to new products. And then I start pursuing the guru of supply chain, Tom Reardon, and I learned a lot from him. And I really believe that, and it's quite ambitious, that we really need to develop a new economic approach that emphasizes innovation and supply chain rather than markets and prices, because that's the way the world is going to. So I will give a little bit of an overview of this approach, and then I give an example from an existing industry, the beef industry. And I develop a lot of my knowledge working with colleagues from Texas A&M, in particular, David Anderson. And so that's where I'm going. Okay, so I'll start with the basic idea. Economics was developed in the 18th century, and most of the concepts are 18th century. Competitive market, one prices, and I think Theodore Schultz was one of the first ones that really popped the bubble and said, God, we really have this equilibrium, we have innovation, we have new product, how do we deal with it? And Coase and Williamson really develop a new approach on the economic of the firm. In AgEcon, Tom Reardon and Sweden start to realize the importance of supply chain. A year ago, when you look at the reform in Eastern Europe or what's going in Africa and India, supply chain are important. And most development economies that I know worry all the time about what happened to small farmers. And they will be small and poor unless the system will change. I never knew till I met Tom Reardon and go to Africa that there are supermarkets in Africa. So we live in a world of, in economics, in terms of development economics, we live in a world of donors that want to hear about poor people rather than world that really see dynamic involvement. So to some extent, we need to understand how supply chain evolve, how new products evolve, how things are moving, and that I'll try to speak for a little bit and then go to cattle. So generally, there are many supply chains and they are all interacting. Now, there is what, in a way, they have a lot of synergies and they have a lot of interdependent, but there are two types of supply chains that are really crucial. There are supply chain of innovation and supply chain of product. Innovation supply chain deal with research, patenting, development, and product supply chain, once innovation is materialized, try to develop a supply chain, and it may include many firms and organizations. So let's speak a little bit about the innovation supply chain. There are three modes. One is the educational industrial complex. The other is recombinant innovation, and the third is relentless innovation. Let's explain. The innovation, the educational supply chain is that one that we are used to, that university do the research, there is technology transfer to private companies, and then industries are developed. And a lot of time academic are part of industry. There are many, many examples. The biotechnology in the US is one great example. It started in universities, moved to the private sector, and a lot of academics become very rich. The same is true in a company like Sony in Japan. The same thing is true a lot of time in electronics. But this is the only part of the picture. A more popular part is recombinant innovation, that someone think about a new concept and use existing technology to generate it. And it's very, very important in many aspects of agriculture. Now, in reality, Ford or Edison didn't develop new science, but it took advantage of non-science of technology to develop new products. And relentless innovation, this is the thing that is driving companies to improve existing innovation. It's really, really crucial element for technological change. Now, I think this is really important when I am in a place like Latin America. I think that the innovation supply chains, except that in agriculture, are not that developed there. And I think one of the challenges is how you develop this innovation supply chain. Now, so if I look at the innovation, the innovators, how they develop supply chain, or I look at it not the innovator, how the entrepreneurs develop supply chain, they have several stages. First, they estimate the demand for products. Now, generally, when they want to estimate demand for product, do they ask economists to do it? No. Economists are not useful for really estimating demand. They ask people at marketing, and we have to ask ourselves why. That's the reality. Economists don't do it. It's done mostly by marketing people or by some economists. But generally, people try to estimate demand, they try to use knowledge from sociology, from economics, in order to realize that there is a product, that there will be a buyer for the product. And they also know that there is heterogeneity, and a key question in developing demand is what will be the appropriate market to start the product. It's not that you have homogeneous producers, consumers that they'll buy it. If you ever try to develop a supply chain to a product, question number one, where do we sell it? The second thing is once you predict demand, you have to make decisions about investment and in terms of, and as well in the long term, how you design the supply chain, what you produce by yourself, what you buy from others, are you vertically integrated? So to some extent, the innovator, the entrepreneur has a lot of market power, and they design market power. Now, I start developing mathematical models that all of them show that, generally speaking, when you come to a supply chain, market structure and markets are endogenous. Now, this is consistent with results that Tom and other people show in reality, but any modeling realizes that you have endogeneity of market structure when you design supply chain. Now, so I developed a very simple model, a two-stage supply chain model, where you have feedstock production, and then you process it to produce a final product. In biofuel, it's clear. You produce sugarcane, and then you have to decide, do I produce it in-house or I buy it from others? So in Brazil, many companies are vertically integrated. They produce the sugarcane and the biofuel. In the US, it's mostly done through contracting. Refiners generally don't own land. In other areas, like in grapes, in wine, some wineries own some of the wine, of the grape, but buy it from others. So to some extent, you try to maximize, at each period, you try to maximize profits. You have to decide how much I produce, how much I buy myself, how much I buy from others, and you have the regular marginal conditions. And and then you are operating under a credit and other constraints. Now, a lot of time what you get that you have a situation that you have a model like middleman, that the entrepreneur has incredible market power. If you look at a company like Apple, and I don't speak about Apple that you eat, Apple is an incredible middleman. They make tons of money because they are monopoly in the output market and monopoly in the input market. And this is not so bad because they are the entrepreneur, and hopefully someone else sooner or later will enter and we will move to monopolistic competition. So generally speaking, if you look at an innovative economy, markets are endogenous, companies come and go. Peter Thiel basically suggested that in many modern economies, you have a monopoly that controls the market till someone else is kicking them out. And I don't think that people can complain too much about what's going on, let's say, in computers or in the cell phone or in other areas. Oh, good. Okay. So you can really look at this model to other areas. There is a big importance for credit, to finance, competition. I don't really have a lot of time to emphasize it, but supply chain is changing over time. You may start very small in one condition, in one location, and evolve over time, taking into account making investment that try to equate the expected net present value with the cost of capital. And so companies like McDonald's or Apple or Amazon are moving from one place to another, and understanding this movement is very important, and hopefully we'll develop models that can quantify it and predict it. Another thing is that we have learning by doing that make supply chain much more effective. And a third point that is very important, that a lot of time you start having a product differentiation. So when you start with a product like a car, you sell it first to the rich, and later on, as the cost of electrical go down, we have several models, some for rich people, others for less rich people. Now, so we have this type of theory, and I really think that it's really important to think on how you develop supply chain in the bioeconomy, because that's the key. You cannot really think about the bioeconomy if you don't think about design of supply chain. And hopefully we start having some model, but I think this is the area for a lot of research. And I think that it's really important that we work with engineers and entrepreneurs to understand it. Now, let's look and see what we learned from the cattle industry in Texas. There are several things that I learned. That first, that supply chain evolve almost in mysterious way. They are driven by economic, by political and technological drivers. There are symbiotic relationship between cattle supply chain, dairy, grain, whether they are all mutually dependent. There is a linkage between innovation and supply chain, and the results here can demonstrate some of the conceptual points and also add more insight. So the supply chain of cattle is very important. You start with feed and cow-calf operation. Till you move to meat and leather and other products, there are many stages. But if we really look at, if we really start to look at the cattle sector of Texas, it's really interesting. It started as a foreign direct investment by Spain. Spain really wanted to make sure that they control North America, and they were worried about France. So what they did, they brought a lot of cattle, and they asked the missionaries, to manage this cattle sector. And so in the beginning, it was a political decision. It wasn't run by a profit organization. It was run by the missions that really represented the state. But when France really lost its holding in North America, the Spanish government really ignored it, and a private cattle sector started. And the cattle sector grew in Texas, and they were selling the cattle to New Orleans. And then suddenly you have the Civil War. And during the Civil War, the number of cows in Texas increased immensely. And after the Civil War, suddenly people that came back needed the industry, and they started the Texas cattle industry that we see in the cowboy movies. So the cattle was the first supply chain to the bioeconomy that started in Texas, and it really gave Texas an edge. Texas basically benefited from two natural resources, cattle and oil. And so what happened between 65 and 85, about 10 million cattle were exported from Texas elsewhere. So you have a supply chain that you grow the cattle in Texas. You have the drive. You have the drive to Chicago or other places, to Omaha, and then you sell the cattle. But then what happened? People start dividing land, introducing a lot of barbed wire. So the drives ended, and at the same time you have the train. So the supply chain changed because of restriction on one hand and new technology on another. Then you have this number that I'll come back to them later on. But then you have the second stage where there were a lot of innovation, and they were recombinant innovation. So what happened was that once people start using train to move from Texas to the north, and you start having a meat packing industry that that includes stockyard, where a lot of the cattle would stay, be fed, and a lot of companies started. And for example, two of the major companies that started there were Swift and Armor. So you have a supply chain that you raise the cattle in Texas, you send it to Chicago or Omaha, and then you have a lot of feedlot around it. Then you process it. The next stage, and one of the key innovation was refrigeration. When you have refrigeration, and in the beginning they have ice, you can really send the cattle through train in boxes where you have a lot of ice all over the country. So this was the second stage. After the Second World War, things changed. The supply chain, there were a lot of unionization. People decided, why do we need to process the cattle in big cities? Let's process it in small cities near where it's grown. And the cattle moved to small cities all over the Midwest. And in the 1960s, there was another innovation, boxed meat. And that was the situation that Iowa beef, and that was later on bought by Tyson, introduced meat in boxes. And now we have something that is called, that we have basically meat that is ready to be shipped to the supermarket. So to some extent, the supply chain moved through a lot of innovation that took advantage of the fact that you have a better ability for weather control, better ability to move things very fast, better ability to differentiate the product. So you really have a supply chain that is changing over time. Another thing that you have about this supply chain, that you produce today from cattle 200 products. So to some stage, you can almost see, look at it as a supply chain that is circular, because almost every part of the cattle is being used. So what we really see is that we have a lot of innovations. Most of these innovations are innovations that are taking advantage of existing technologies from elsewhere that really look at the physical side of the cattle. But one of the things that happen is that with this innovation, the leading companies are changing. For example, Armor, there are 4 companies that were dominant in 1900. Now there are new companies. Tyson became a biggest company in cattle. Cargill, National Beef, 3 new companies enter. So what we can see, you have concentration, 4 major companies that control most of the industry, a lot of small producer and technological changes that are occurring throughout it. Now, at the same time, the genetic was changing, and in the genetic, a lot of the changes was educational industrial complex. In the beginning, the main breed was Texas Longhorn, but now the major breeds are Angus and Brahma. There are several other breeds, but what really happening is that there is a parallel supply chain in animal health and in genetics that is done by universities. Now, how does the educational industrial complex work? You have people at universities, and they work especially in the veterinarian school. There is a supply chain of veterinarians. There is supply chain of consultants, and so to some extent, there are all the time we really see a new type of innovations. When it comes to cows, 80% artificial insemination. In cattle, now we have about 10% artificial insemination. There is more and more selective breeding. With better breeding, you start having some major farmers that are breed cattle, let others use this cattle, and then they process it and sell it to the major producers. So to some extent, we have new genetics that enter to the process. There is very, very little use of genetic innovation. I wrote a paper that show how much society lose by not using GMO and CRISPR in livestock. The loss is hundreds of billions a year. But in any case, slowly things are happening. Slowly people start introducing genomic knowledge. There is more and more selection based on genomics. There is more and more using even of cloning. So to some extent, you really have two types of supply chains, so or two types of industries. Industries that are evolved by taking advantage of knowledge in other industries, especially when it comes to the farming processes, to the mechanics, to the cooling, and then the genetics where the universities are playing a very important role. Now, what happened is that a lot of the development in the US and Europe are moving slowly throughout the world, and you have supply chains that are similar, and one of the big challenges is how you incorporate, let's say, people in developing countries to this type of system. Now, now one of the things that we are starting to see is that people start using CRISPR and GMO to some extent, but it's very, very limited. There is a company called Neogene that develop genetic screening, and people start, and there are a lot of hopes that it will be used, but I think that 10 or 15 years from now, things will happen. I hope that in Latin America, people will take advantage, given they have a much more progressive legislation, and they would really use more effectively new genetic tools in the cattle industry because the potential is there. Now, what are the applications? You can increase input use efficiency. Today, you get about a ratio between 4 to 7 to 1 to produce beef. Now, if you look at chicken, the ratio is 2 to 1. So I think this is one area of improvement to reduce the time that it takes to cattle to grow, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of challenges there. So if you look at what happened in beef production, the production is increasing, but the number of cows is declining. So to some extent, the productivity of cows is increasing, and I think it can increase in the future. Now, another thing is the emphasis on quality. People start to introduce branded product, price differentials based on quality, and with genetic, I think we will be able to do it more. The one example of the emphasis on quality, that today most of the beef in the US is either there is increasing in the role of choice and prime versus select. So the quality of beef is increasing. So to some extent, you can really see how the supply chain is improving and how science is entering to the industry. Now, the other thing that you see, less and less reliance on market and more reliance on negotiated prices, and negotiated prices basically based on quality, which really strengthens my point that the old-fashioned way of using on a homogeneous product as a price is disappearing, and instead you start having hedonic prices that's based on characteristics. Now, there are a lot of issues that don't have time, but I like to summarize. to speak what are the challenges of the industry, how to deal with climate change, and there will be issues of diseases, issues of yield, locational shifts. You cannot grow a lot of cattle in Texas, but there will be a lot of opportunities, let's say, in Canada. Carbon regulation that would really require to introduce new varieties that emit less methane and improve health. Then you really need to develop improve life cycle and reduce the short of cattle. The biggest challenge that I see in the cattle industry today, like in agriculture, is the biotechnology is in flux. All of you know my view about what I think. I think that Europe basically keeps the rest of the world in some sort of a bind, not allowing people to use CRISPR or new technologies. And I think that this really affects the livestock sector even more than it affects the crop sector. And I think that's a big issue. So what does it mean from economists? We really need to understand to look at the technology and supply chain to find, then we can understand the role of subsidies, the role of credit, to understand that monopolies sometimes are needed, that the key element is not to prevent monopolies, but to allow entry, and to realize that when we speak about carbon pricing as the only solution, it's naive, because you really need, probably difficult politically, but a lot of time what you need for industry is to develop the credit and the finance and even regulation that assures the industry that they will have demand. We have success stories, like Tesla is a success story, and solar energy is a success story, and they were developed because you allowed supply chain to be developed. So the other thing that as economists, we need to be multidisciplinary. My analysis here is superficial because I don't know a lot about cattle. But if we really want to understand what's going on, we need to understand what other industries are doing and how supply chain are built, and that require that we not only collect data, but collect stories and understand basic relationships. So by more terms, the conclusion, we have to recognize the relationship between innovation of supply chain, develop understanding and modeling of supply chain, develop policy based on it. That if I look at the cattle sector supply chain are evolving. There are productivity gains that reduce the number of cattle and improve quality. But there are a lot of challenges in the future. It's a source of greenhouse gases. It's very inefficient. And obviously, with better technologies and policies, it will move forward. This is for me, and now I'll move it to Tom.
Brilliant talk, David. And I've learned so much from David Zilberman over these past 5-6 years, working together on value chains. And I wanted to also briefly start my talk by mentioning, because David mentioned his journey of getting into working on supply chain and supply chain transformations. And my journey started in Buenos Aires in 1999, and also in Sao Paulo in 1999, where I really sat at the feet of several gurus of supply chain transformation happening in Argentina and in Brazil. And I went from being what David called a development economist that was focused on small farms and farms only, and really got turned on about supply chains and opened my eyes through what was happening in Argentina and Brazil and Chile, how quickly and profoundly supply chains were transforming in the agri-food sector. And Graciela Guezan from Universidad Nacional de Mar del Plata was key in my development and opening my eyes. Graciela Gutman, University of Buenos Aires, now in CONICET, and Elizabeth Farina, University of Sao Paulo. So really, I was my journey started right where you're sitting, and then over the years, I've got more and more interested in how agri-food value chains not just transform, but deal with the various massive shocks that they have to undergo. And very often, they're not dealing with these shocks alone, but they're really dealing with it in a family or a cluster or what we call a dendritic system of value chains that are co-pivoting and pivoting to make the resilient strategies operational. So we've called this symbiotic resilience. And in this talk, I'll go over some of the ideas and then mainly illustrations of this symbiotic resilience occurring in agri-food product, input, and service value chains in the face of shocks. And when we think about shocks, we have to think that really the agri-food sector, not just at the farm level, but in all of the supply chain segments, has been shocked relentlessly over the past 20, maybe 25 years, et cetera. And these shocks have occurred as a kind of cascade. So maybe you're starting a business, you're working on a supply chain, and then you're hit again with a new shock, and then again with a new shock, again with a new shock. And what have been those shocks? We'll talk about them now as a taxonomy. And in each case, the shock imposed new or intensified transaction costs and input costs. Of course, the one that we've thought about so much in this past couple of years, but was very important in China, was the SARS shock of human disease and new regulations related to it. And you can think of COVID and essentially starting in 2003 with SARS in China, and then 20 years later, being a global event with COVID-19, very deeply affecting supply chains. And then there was also a series of phytosanitary crises and new regulations. So I'm kind of classing regulation changes along with the actual physical shock, because that's what really the regulation changes, as well as demand and supply changes, were the physical shock to the, or were the shocks to the actors in the supply chain. So an example that I'll come back to is BSD, black spot disease in citrus, and EU regulations that were seen by the South Africans, for example, as major shocks to their supply chain. A third set that overlaps with what David was talking about are animal disease crises and new biosecurity regulations like avian flu really affected Southeast Asian supply chains. Then, of course, so important is the climate shocks with hurricanes and droughts and heat and floods causing a rise in risks and costs. And just recently, there was these devastating hurricanes in Central America that deeply disrupted banana value chains, again, disrupted by war. And of course, that affected both the farming side and the logistics sides. There's been drought and heat shock on cattle value chains in Brazil. And of course, crop pest spikes from heat and rain. Then fifth, that has really gone along with the supply chain shocks as well as regulatory changes has been how labor costs and labor availability have changed over the past couple of years with these shocks, with higher labor costs induced by COVID, but also induced by migratory regulations constraining labor supply. And sixth, we have now and have had, but it's really intensifying in certain ways for certain supply chains, internal and international conflict. I'm studying Boko Haram as a shock to supply chains inside Nigeria, but also international supply chains disrupted with the war in Ukraine. And finally, even if we think about climate and war and these kinds of things as the really prototypical shocks, from the point of view of a value chain operator, the private standards in global value chains that have increased so rapidly over the past couple decades, really where, as I said, I learned these ideas in Argentina and Brazil. The private standards changing so quickly are themselves massive shocks that require adjustment and resilience by supply chain actors, for example, in fruit and meat. And here's a foundering ship. Actually, this ship looks a little bit like the airplane that I tried to take from Atlanta to go to Buenos Aires. So that didn't work. Supply chain failure on the airplane industry. So these shocks, though, seem to be sequential from the way I just talked, but very often they're simultaneous. It's not just a series of shocks, but often a confluence of, I love that word, you know, con and fluence, from rivers flowing together, of shocks that come together and pummel a value chain. An example that we've studied recently is Nature Ripe, the berry company, multinational berry company. And, you know, they come to my undergraduate class and talk about the woes of the past couple of years. Amazing. They said they're hit by lockdowns from COVID. Then they're hit by container shortages. They're hit by hurricanes. They're hit by fuel price hikes. And all with the background roar of tremendous competition with foreign direct investment from a number of companies in the berry space globally. And I'll talk about that in a second. But you can also think not just a series of shocks or a confluence of shocks, but the fact that the shocks happen to cluster of value chains that are closely related, which David and I in the 2019 paper called a dendritic system of interdependent value chains. With output value chains, for example, farms to consumers of berries, farm input value chains, blueberry seedlings to farmers, and then research and development and extension value chains, which in David and my paper in the 2022, we call innovation supply chains. So you have the blueberry breeding value chain, for example. We have a paper with Karina Gallardo on that issue. And you have also, of course, the breeding of the beef. And then finally, you have lateral value chains that are often understudied and underappreciated. But I've become quite obsessed with the logistics value chain. And you also have credit and labor and fuel and energy value chains that are proper value chains that are supplying each segment of the value chains that are noted above. So if you have a failure in one of these value chain sets, all of them fall together. Okay, so they all need to be resilient, and they tend to help each other. And helping each other to stay afloat keeps them all alive. And we call this symbiotic resilience. And this is where there's a term very, very often used now in the business management literature, and now in the public, it's sort of been mainstreamed into public discussion, is the word pivoting. You know, where you pivot. Pivoting is a basic and abrupt change that you make, which could involve threshold investments in new practices, new products, new technologies. So you're pivoting, and then other value chains in that dendritic system of value chains are co-pivoting with you to facilitate your pivoting. Okay, so this is what we study, this sort of group, or it can be managed or not managed, it can be spontaneous, but coordinated and symbiotic pivoting and co-pivoting by the various value chains. And the pivoting requires co-pivoting by firms in other segments of the same value chain or in other value chains in that dendritic cluster. And you know, we've called it in symbiotic value chain relationships in the Journal of Economic Geography. And some examples that were used in that paper, as well as a more recent one, and I'll get it more into it in terms of shocks, but we were already thinking about it in terms of the transformation of supply chains before thinking of the shocks that have, of course, risen in the public eye in the past. But a good example is, again, by Graciela Guizan, that I learned so much from her in her paper in 2002, looking at how specialized wholesalers emerged from the traditional wholesale sector or outside of it, and fresh cut firms for produce, for example, co-pivoted with emerging supermarkets and fast food chains in Argentina in the 1990s. So this was a case of the new actors emerging and quickly changing what they're doing to meet the needs of another set of actors, these supermarkets and fast food chains that had tremendous challenges that they need to meet quickly to be competitive in a market that had been dominated mainly by traditional firms. And then there's also, of course, the emerging, the case of emerging large dairy firms with innovative packaging firms like Tetra Pak co-pivoting with the emerging large dairy firms. And we have a paper in 2005 on Argentina and Brazil of this sort of changes that occurred in the packaging sector supply chain to meet the needs of large processors like Nestle and others. There's also the case, again, because I'm thinking of Cono Sur, where you are, is the co-pivoting by logistics firms like the multinational Penske that entered Brazil to work with emerging supermarket chains, some of which were foreign direct investments, some of which were local supermarket chains, to quickly modernize procurement system, to fast track, as we said in the 2007 paper, to fast track modernization of supply chains by having the co-pivoting of logistics firms to rewrite, to reform, to re-engineer, to redesign the value chains that are supplying the supermarkets to give them a competitive edge. And finally, and this has been so exciting for me to learn from David about all the things related to breeding and genetics, et cetera, is innovation supply chains such as the fruit or animal breeding genetic firms that I'll talk about a little bit in a second. He certainly did. Co-pivoting with trade innovating product supply chains like the blueberry supply chain, having co-pivoting by the blueberry breeding supply chain. I'll come back to that. And as firms and value chains together, sometimes as sets, pivot and co-pivot, maybe over time, they form what we call resilience assets to facilitate further pivoting and co-pivoting. They form muscles of resilience by reacting to and as a set, being resilient to shocks. And I'll give an example of that in South Africa. And often policies and public investments play a crucial role in facilitating the ability to make the innovations and to make the resilience investments. So in the following, we illustrate links between our taxonomy of shocks to value chains and the concept of symbiotic resilience. And each case will be over and over the same thing. There'll be a shock, there'll be buildup of resilience assets, there'll be a flurry of pivoting and co-pivoting, and then we'll see what have been the role of public policies to help that happen. And I'll do it by supply chain segments to order the discussion. So many interesting examples. But one of them that was really in all of our minds recently is what happened with e-commerce, certainly during COVID. And e-commerce continues to roar along, maybe not at quite the same pace as during COVID, but it's really here to stay and it's growing. And we did a paper on China and India mainly of e-commerce rise by retailers and food service as a response to a cascade of shocks and drivers. And really fascinating is SARS, the China 2003 version of COVID, started e-commerce in China because they were doing business to business e-commerce or digital trade. And then they shifted to consumer e-commerce when people were locked down in the SARS crisis in 2003. That really started in many developing countries, a rapid rise of e-commerce. And that was only intensified, not started, but intensified in the 2019 COVID. And of course, all of it was intensified and facilitated and required by the context that was changing. The same thing that drove the supermarket revolution was driving the e-commerce revolution, and it was shocks, urbanization, congestion, opportunity cost of shoppers' time. And as David mentioned, very often these changes occurred by a need occurring and then people grabbing a technology that was on the shelf. This same David Land's wonderful book on the Industrial Revolution, where he says there were several major technologies that were on the shelf, not being really used, not being implemented, not being combined. And then suddenly the need arose, the income and the demand arose for textiles, especially in that case. And then they take the technologies off the shelf and they go into action. This is the same that happened with e-commerce. Digitalization was on the shelf and then it was quickly implemented. And during the implementation of it, resilience assets were built up. And very often you have to really combine the story of investment in resilient assets with lead firms that are intensively undertaking foreign direct investment to build the capacity for the pivot, for the new action, and also transfer knowledge and technology. And this certainly happened in e-commerce. So what happened, as you all know, because you're all sitting there having lived this, pivoting and co-pivoting occurred very successfully and rapidly, especially in several sets of countries, with the rapid acceleration of e-commerce, for example, in Latin America, pivoting by logistics firms. For example, Uber went from moving people to moving food. And there was a very rapid growth of delivery intermediaries, similar to Instacart in the US. And the roles of policies were, again, very important in whether this kind of change occurred. In some cases, the co-pivoting was facilitated. Really fantastic cases in China where there was good infrastructure, policies that adapted and helped delivery intermediaries to rise and logistics firms to retool and meet the needs of the developing e-commerce, especially, well, during the several decades before, but especially during the COVID crisis. And here you have an example. In some cases, though, policy strangled the pivoting and co-pivoting. And we have a paper on this in Nigeria during COVID. What the policymakers didn't know is that almost all the maize in Nigeria supply chains is moved by third-party logistics. They didn't know that. They thought it was basically wholesalers that were moving it. So during the crisis, they declared logistics non-essential services. This impeded truck movements and basically strangled, the supply chain, even when they declared retail and wholesale essential. So really understanding how the supply chain works, the nuts and bolts, to be able to do the right policies to help the innovations, to help the pivoting and co-pivoting to be resilient is crucial. A second example, which is in the midstream and upstream, is in South Africa, citrus exports. We have a paper, Ferdy Myers, who led this paper, very fascinating, pointing out, during COVID time, that the citrus industry in South Africa already was very used to a set of big shocks where they had to change everything deeply all the time. And this occurred because they got used to 20 years of black spot disease events and EU phytosanitary regulations, which are good for EU, but were seen as a shock to the South Africans and that they needed to adjust to. And all of that against the backdrop of retail chains, private quality standards that have been rising. So they built up resilience assets. They built up their ability to pivot and co-pivot by exporters, ports, packing houses, and farmers working together. And they had an asset that was crucial, which was their association, supply chain segment association, that looked at the shocks and helped everybody to adjust together. This is a case more of managed, symbiotic resilience. And unlike some countries, like I mentioned, Nigeria, the South African government was really listening to what the private sector needed. So when you needed regulations or infrastructural changes to facilitate the pivoting and co-pivoting, the government knew what was happening and helped with it. And here's their citrus. And so, of course, with that, you had pivoting and co-pivoting success. South Africa increased their market share during COVID to the European Union. Okay, and so and increased their share into Asia. Now, of course, you had some very interesting policy problems that occurred in course corrections. Again, thinking about how much do policymakers understand, how open and listening are they to the issues of supply chains working together to be resilient. And the example from South Africa is the wood value chain, because the wood and forestry value chain, the beginning of COVID in South Africa was declared to be non-essential, okay? And then in a year into it, they realized, wow, because wood and the forest products can't move to the crate production manufacturers, and the crates can't move to the fruit packing plants, and the packing plants can't move the fruit to the ports, and the ports to the world, they then pivoted at the government level and it reclassified the wood and forestry value chain as essential. Okay, so, and that was because the government was really listening to the private sector association. A third, and I think fascinating example, is the midstream and midstream co-pivoting together. And this is an example from our paper in 2018, where you have Chatham Popcon, I know I don't pronounce it correctly, CP, really pivoting deeply with a lot of climate shocks and other kinds of shocks, typhoons, bird flu, policy shifts with the food crisis in 2008. CP began to really retool and change the structure of its supply chain, building up resilient assets. This is a fascinating story to me because they told this story at a conference where I was talking about supermarket procurement change. People said to CP, what have you done to deal with climate shocks in the Southeast Asia area to be able to supply these regionally sourcing supermarkets? And they said, in Thailand, where we have the largest rice mill in the world, we built redundant ports. We built a big port for our operation on the sea, and then inland on the river, another port, and then further inland, another port. We have 3 ports. So if one port goes down, then the next port comes up. And of course, you're thinking that takes money. And so in this case, sometimes resilience assets are built up by firms that were already strong and become stronger during the crisis. So that's a separate issue. And they began to diversify their sourcing. They began to compartmentalizing their supply chains. They worked with their logistics partners to put up these new resilience, symbiotic resilience strategies. And they had pivoting and co-pivoting success during the storms. Here's a large rice mill. Another example, and here we're going upstream, swimming where David was recently swimming in his talk in terms of input supplies and breeding, and looking at how value chains have co-pivoted with breeding value chains. And we have a paper with Karina Gallardo that's looking at fruit value chains and breeding value chains co-pivoting. Very fascinating because the fruit value chains, for example, the berries, blueberries, have been hit by a series of shocks. I'm not talking about climate shocks so much here as hit by market shocks. Some of it intensified by COVID. For example, retailers really started to ask the blueberry firms for much more shelf life stable fruit, okay, because you can't have very fragile fruit and then have supply chains that are late or where the fruit has to wait, etc. So there's a demand for more shelf life and at the same time for more taste. And a speaker on blueberries in my class at Michigan State University called it a varieties war, that it went from, and this is a product cycle idea, it went from commodity blueberries to then a huge rush on to differentiate the varieties of blueberries to gain traction in a market that's become very competitive. Okay, and so they built up resilience assets through combinations, which I'll emphasize quickly as I end my talk or go through the last part of the talk, as a triangle, a triangle, a triangle. Okay, you have a triangle of actors like a breeding firm, Fall Creek Nursery in Oregon, breeding for blueberry growers, packers, and shippers, and essentially relying on those firms to make deals with them so that they can have scale in their breeding. But the grower, packer, shippers need also a guaranteed source of new differentiated varieties, sometimes proprietarial varieties that they can use to gain an edge in an extremely competitive market. And then retailers requiring that both of them work together and provide proprietarial or at least new varieties to the retailer to be able to fight it out also in a competitive market. So you have an alliance of 3 in a triangle, and that produced a cascade of new varieties. Here's Fall Creek Nursery. Here's Fall Creek Nursery. And then, David, I won't go into this much, but the cattle value chain is another example where with climate shock, there's a big demand for disease and heat resistance in cattle production, for example, in Brazil, with a cascade of shocks, increase for quality beef by domestic and international processors, David pointed out in his talk, combined with the shock of climate change with increased heat. So in many things, in chicken, in cattle, there's a big move to take productive species and breeds and tropicalize them so that they're able to deal more with shocks. Of course, this is happening with wheat and other products as well with climate shocks. And there was a building up again in a triangle of resilience assets. Breeding firms like Neogen, mentioned also by David, based in Michigan, they talked to my class, fascinating, made deals with Brazilian Cattle Producers Association so they could be there, understand what the variety and trait needs are in the Brazil specific context. So they made alliances with them. And then of course, the beef processors and retailers requiring various things of this supply chain. So there's a triangle of alliance or coordination, symbiosis. And so part of the outcome of this sort of symbiotic resilience was a cascade of new breeds, tropicalizing European breeds, for example. Another example, again, a speaker at my undergraduate class at Michigan State University was from Corteva Agriscience, talking about how disease and climate resilience requirements for corn and soybeans internationally have really driven them to have a portfolio of input products, a portfolio of breeding, and to pivot with the needs of both farmers and processors. So there's a cascade of shocks and drivers that this firm pointed out to us, a demand increase for genetically modified seeds plus chemical and seed treatment packages. I'm very aware of the fact that I'm speaking to a huge room of people that know infinitely more about this than I do. So I put it at that and note that, in fact, resilience assets were again built up in a triangle. Corteva's main research and development and seed treatment and seed multiplication operations with, for example, foreign direct investment in France with site specific R&D, then working with seed distributors and working with farmers. So they're listening to what farmers' needs are. The seed distributors are listening to what farmers' needs are and what supply possibilities are from Corteva. And Corteva is listening to both of them in a triangle of resilience. So the outcome is, of course, a cascade of new varieties and chemical portfolios. And here's a picture of their French operation. And finally, let's go all the way upstream and think about how services co-pivot with the needs of farmers and retailers to very rapidly change traits and quantities and volumes of product that are available for the market. A beautiful example is from Geneviève Nguyen's work with colleagues in France, where there was a gigantic jump by the main supermarket chains for eco-certified vegetables. And so you had a co-pivoting by outsourced services. She was noting that there was a big jump in the demand from European consumers and large retail chains for eco-certified vegetables, part of a retail war to be able to dominate this new product cycle step. And doing that at scale for a gigantic market required big asset threshold investments in skills and equipment at the farming level and upstream in the supply chain. For example, drones for monitoring. At the same time, there was a rise of huge farms. The examples that she treats, several farm and their outgrowers have 40% of the vegetable market in all of France. Okay, so you have these huge farms that have to co-pivot with the retailers very quickly and get their outgrowers on board and understanding and having the ability to produce eco-label villages of vegetables. So what do? At the same time, you're not in a situation where you can just multiply costs. You have tremendous cost pressure from the competition from supermarket chains. And as she points out in her paper, penny counting consumers. They want low prices for the product, but they also want it eco-labeled. It's a double pincers. So how to react to this kind of shock? Resilience assets were built up, again, with a triangle. Outsourced mobile services firms, A to Z services. I started my life 20 years ago hearing about these A to Z services in the case of El Tejar in Argentina that had operations in Argentina, Brazil as an A to Z service firm. And here it is in the vegetables in France, co-pivoting with huge vegetable farmers and huge retailers. So it's three giants or two giants working together and outsourced mobile services helping them. So the conclusions, and I'm conscious of time, probably I went over, is that there's a lot of symbiotic resilience among value chains, and it needs to be understood and studied much more. And especially because we're hit with all these crises, it needs to be facilitated more. There's pivoting by segments of product value chains. There's co-pivoting by other segments in the value chains. There's co-pivoting by whole value chains, like breeding value chains, co-pivoting to make available new traits, new inputs, new services. And in that, very often, there's a crucial role of foreign direct investment by the co-pivoting firms, and especially to facilitate this kind of resilience, there's a crucial role for public investments and policies in facilitating and smoothing co-adaptation. Thank you very much.
Quick question about how distinctive this kind of symbiotic resilience is in the ag, food, bioeconomy space. So I'm wondering if you can give maybe specific examples or a compelling example of what makes that idea of shocks and resilience in a value chain distinctive in bio-life sciences, agri-food, as opposed to just about any other value chain you could think of. What is it? What's the unique or distinctive, and why?
So thank you, Travis. I think that there's, of course, two answers to that. One is there's a lot of, as David pointed out, there's a lot of similarity, and this is a debate that's being had in the global value chain literature, right? Because you have networks and net chains and clusters and pivoting and co-pivoting that are occurring along, for example, the mobile, start my video, oops, that are occurring along the supply chain segments and between supply chains. So in the non-food domain, you have essentially the same thing occurring. On the other hand, and this is at the ICABR2023 conference, we were talking about this a lot because we had a person there, Daria, who's been working a lot on mobile phone value chains and how they're pivoting and co-pivoting and changing. And but she saw, and I saw, I think, fundamental differences also with the agri-food on this in the case of perishability, in the case of some site specificity of certain kinds of production that's not as easily moved, in the breeding and the genetics aspect that might also require different kinds of responses. And also, for example, in the example I gave of Neogen going to Brazil, there's a need for the co-pivoting breeders, for example, to be able to be in site-specific relationships. They're buying laboratories and associating with the cattle and other kinds of associations around the world in order to be there to work with farmers. That's another element that's different in the agri-food space, that have a lot of sometimes more complex and less standardizable operations. And so the pivoters have to be sometimes more in situ to be able to observe the problems and needs of the co-pivoting and adapt to it. So I would say perishability, location specificity, in some case, less of globalized value chains, because as you know, most agri-food products in the world are not traded, right? They're basically domestically produced. And so there's a lot of domestic element of that. And then of course, the complexity the new elements of genetic change. I don't know if that's a very good answer, but that's my initial answer. Thank you.
I personally think that we don't think as economists in this term, which is a problem. That's what I really like about what Tom is doing. In any industry, there is this element that there are shocks, and then company respond, they pivot, and then the partner respond, and then you may develop triangles or even more of, and we really don't think about it. We think about the profit maximizing firm and comparative statics, but the reality is more complex. And that's the reason that this type of thinking is really important for the bioeconomy. So we have to realize how things are linked together, and every time there is a shock, we have to deal with it, and we have to teach our students to think this way. What really happened, in my view, in economics, is that we ignore supply chain, and we really think about one firm that relates to one market, which is nice. But the reality is that we have all this relationship, and what Tom did, I think he did incredible amount of developing a framework and identifying how things are working. A big challenge is to quantify it, but at least we have a great framework to say, okay, you have a shock, what happened, what type of asset you build, how you adjust to this shock, and I think this is something that we really need to introduce to our vocabulary, and that to me is the purpose of this session. Any other questions?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Tom. I relate to your comment, and I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on it a bit more. I like the idea of changing from economics of the firm to the economics of the supply chain, but the economics of the firm, it's a simple model. Once you get the intuition, you do know the result of any shock, how it will be implemented on different comparative sizes, price quantity relationship, etc. Moving to the supply chain, what are the 2-3 key elements that we need to introduce, and whether the basic intuition of economists will change when we talk about supply chains comparing to firms? Maybe it's not an easy question to answer in 2 minutes, but can you give us some tips on it?
Oh, I think that like even I didn't do the mathematics here, but the same model that you can expand the modeling to an element supply chain, and you still have basic type of responses. You have a shock, it's a discrete shock, or you have a continuous shock, price goes up. And then every moment you really have to decide who will be your partners, and sometimes you have a new partner, who will be your product, sometimes you have a new product. What is a pivoting? You introduce a new solution. You cannot, you have a pandemic, you cannot sell, people don't come to the supermarket, you start using digital technology, and you have a new partner called Uber that basically brings the product to the consumer. The thing is that the economic tools are there. What we are really looking as economists is we need to work with other disciplines, or we need to use our imagination to see what will happen. And when we don't really think this way, we are very pessimistic. The reason that I asked Madhu, for example, about how do you see biotechnology affecting the bioenergy sector, I think it's really important because you have a lot of shocks, and maybe one solution is to have new varieties. And actually, if you give a good example, if you cannot deal with lignin, you may develop a new type of tree that basically bypass the lignin. But you really don't really have a perspective on businesses unless you realize that they have much more freedom than in our simple model.
Hello. Thank you, David and Tom, for both your talks. This is Jorge Celari from the Center of Development Research in Bonn. When we talk about supply chain regulations, in Europe, one big topic right now is the due diligence regulations and deforestation regulations. So basically, deforestation-linked products will not be allowed to enter the European market, right? And so this is, of course, a policy that's introduced by the demand side, right, in a very unilateral form. And how do you think the supply chains in developing countries in Brazil, for example, soy supply chains might adapt to these kinds of demand sides and unilateral regulations? Do you foresee any kind of innovations happening in order to comply with this regulation? Or do you think maybe the actors will simply shift the supply to markets that have lower standards like China?
Tom, can you respond?
Yes, I'm fascinating question because I was doing some work in Ecuador last year and this came up. And one of the things is that there, obviously, in order the Borlaug hypothesis or whatever, green revolution allowed you to produce more on the same land and to not deforest in India and others. And so in that sense, obviously sustainable intensification on the farms is going to be necessary to not ingress into the forest. And there'll be a very differential because of the heterogeneity of a lot of farms, for example, banana farms in Ecuador. Some of them can easily meet that requirement by intensifying and also by monitoring and by proving that they didn't use the forest, etc. But that's very difficult especially for small farms and micro farms that are using already techniques that are either extensive or interspersed into the forest or don't have the means to do this intensification. So I think that of course gets back to all of your bioeconomic discussions about how to sustainably intensify without moving into the comments. So I think that will be necessary. Of course, there'll be those countries or farms that can't make that move and can't prove that they made the move and will shift to other markets. And that occurs, of course, if you even think of the beef cattle, the biggest beef producer, the beef seller in the world is India. And they're selling beef to non-demanding markets in terms of quality, et cetera. And they're not trying to meet that mark. So in that case, you can make some growth if there's demand for non-deforestation certification markets. So both things, shift markets and shift production where you can, seems to be the answer to your question. Whether it's implementable or not is another question.
Well, I think, 1 second. I think that Tom mentioned about resilience asset. Companies, organizations that have resilience assets survive. It's a survivors of the fittest. So what happened is Europe will say, okay, you cannot export this or that. Then suddenly someone in Europe will do it. But then you will have about, I don't know, 200,000 farmers in Brazil that will be out of business, and then they will migrate to Europe. So to some extent, I think a lot of time you have to take into account what happened, and then you have to say, God, how can we develop a lot of time mechanism to develop some resilience asset in these countries? Generally speaking, at least in my experience, every time that you make requirement more difficult, you increase the gap between rich and poor. So I think organic farming is great for farmers in California. It's not so great for farmers in developing countries. So I think this is one of the big issues that you really have to realize, that when you have this regulation, a lot of times they are essential, you really need to have adaptation so people can survive.
Just a little footnote there, because when I mentioned about CP in Asia having redundant ports, one thing that's very clear is that not only at the farm level, when you have shocks or requirements and you have threshold investments and you have concentration, also at the midstream and processing level and retail level, where the ones that are able to make those, for example, CP made deals with ports and grain companies in Indonesia, so in also a trilateral relationship. That takes a lot of money, and you have to really promise the ability to deliver on a big market, to be able to have an entire city that support, revamp their port to be able to make it possible for your company to source from their area. So I think that this whole thing of symbiotic resilience can lead to more smooth supply chains and more smooth food availability, but also has the issue of concentration lurking around every corner. Thank you.
Madhu,
Hi, Tom. This is Madhu Khanna. Thanks for a really interesting talk. So, you mentioned the pivoting by firms and producing eco-certified products and things. And I was wondering, or, the example also of like Uber shifting from transporting people to transporting food and so on. And I was wondering what you've sort of, from your experience, what does it really take to induce pivoting by firms and when it comes to not incremental pivoting, like passengers to food, but rather more disruptive pivoting that might take place. For example, so let's say bio-based, developing supply chains for bio-based products, which would be a very disruptive change. What would be really needed in order to make that kind of thing happen?
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, with the bio-base, of course, I'm in a room full of, and I'm speaking to Madhu and David as the gurus of what it takes to get change in regulations and business activity. But I can say one of my favorite examples is the South African example of citrus, because essentially there was a building up of muscles of resilience, and you start with one crisis. So crisis induces opportunity. Obviously, everybody repeats that the word crisis in Chinese is essentially a picture of opportunity. And so you have a situation where to keep your deal going, you can't pivot away to another market yet. Okay, you're faced with a market that is your main market, and they tell you to do something very different and to prove something different, and you have to change everything. That kind of crisis moment starts the pivoting and forms the citrus, inter-segment value chain associations, forms the ability, at various particular segments to make changes in citrus production, citrus moving, et cetera. Then once they formed that initial crisis built the initial muscles. Then they got private standards changes, and they already, had the muscles built up. So, and then they had the COVID shock, and muscles built up. So very often in many of these stories, there's an initial shock, like the SARS in China in 2003, moved Alibaba. Alibaba is a foreign direct investment of Japan and the US in 1999. Basically, it was a business-to-business firm. It didn't have any e-commerce. It wasn't one of these giant tigers, in e-commerce. Then you had the crisis where everybody was locked up at home. And so you see the crisis, but also it's often the smart and observant companies and countries that see the crisis, see that it can be an opportunity, and then make the necessary investments. That's why I say South Africa. If South Africa had been like the Nigerian government, then the companies and the segments of the value chain might have said, oh, let's pivot deeply, but then they would have been held back by regulations or by lack of complementary investments in ports and whatever that were quickly done. So having a smart government that's listening to it makes flexible and smooth the transitions of these kinds of pivoting. Good, smart listening governments, private sector, public sector interaction, often a lot of listening across the value chain where the breeders are listening to what the farmers are needing and what the retailers are needing. That's why these triangles also helped build the muscles for resilience, but also added to the inducement to make the pivoting, because they were in these relationships, they relied on each other. They needed, if they wanted to scale, they needed to reduce risk and have these joint solutions. And so they were listening to each of the new needs. And that was also inducing. So collaboration, investment, facilitation, and being a fire under your chair to move forward in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank
No, I think really that actually, I think this can combine the two approaches. I really think you have a shock, you need to have an innovation supply chain and a product supply chain. If you have enough smarts to have a recombinant innovation, look at all what's around you and to modify something, then you can develop a product. So you have a shock. Uber sees that there is a shock. They have the capacity to move things. They cannot take customers. They take advantage of the situation. So generally, when you have a shock, you need the capacity to innovate. Once you have the capacity to innovate, you get some partner and you develop a product supply chain. So I think if you combine the two approaches that we have, that approach that is more, that really describe the process and a more like innovation product supply chain, you can really see how you respond to shocks. So thank you. I think we are over. Now we have now I think we have a lunch break, but thank you for this session and thank you, Tom, for wonderful contribution. Thanks.
I wish.